my speech will be a little bit less structured, maybe a bit briefer, but I wanted to first talk about some experiences I've had actually collaborating with policymakers in research and how useful I've found that in tackling those problems. And actually that journey for me started by making submissions to consultations. It got me thinking about the issues in New Zealand, right? Especially in our accounting and finance department, most people, if you're focused on publishing papers in the good journals, you study the US market, right? Why would you study New Zealand? No one wants to read that in the international journals. However, things are changing, right? And if you pick problems that are interesting and unique and potentially applicable across the world, then you can also publish as well as collaborating with those policymakers. So there's really a couple of projects, and I'm quite young, so I haven't done a lot. A couple of projects I wanted to talk to a little bit and that experience that I had. So the Forestry Ministry Advisory Group, which is an entity that is actually closing down, unfortunately, but they provide advice to the Minister of Forestry and sit inside MPI. And they put out a request for proposals around, what is the demand for offsetting carbon credits, right? And so I think I came across that because I'd submitted on the consultation around the permanent forest category last year that we're doing again for some reason. And our research office flagged me and was like, hey, do you want to submit? And I was like, oh, I'll give it a go. But then I also had built connections through talking about these issues with actually two of the members that were on that group. So they already knew me, right? So I think that helps in New Zealand especially. And so we ended up being successful in our bid, and we got to run a survey on carbon offsetting in New Zealand and New Zealand entities' demand, right? Got a good response. And one of the key things we found was that, the expectations of the future carbon price are high, right? So these businesses mainly thought that prices were going to keep going up because that's what the government has indicated. That's how we actually use it as a lever for change. And they also actually had high intentions for abatement, right? So we asked them about their emissions reductions plans and how much of that was offsetting, abatement, or insetting, which is planting your own forests. And I think it was about 80% on average was to abatement, right? So they had high abatement intentions. A lot of them had started some projects around abatement, but they also had high future price expectations. Now, this survey ran from December to January. Does anyone know what happened to the carbon price since then? Hands up if you think it went up. Hands up if you think it went down, right? So those expectations have changed, right? So that report, I think, highlights a risk for those emissions reductions plans to potentially also change, right? If price expectations have now changed, well, maybe now we don't think emissions are going to be that costly, so what's the business case for abating our emissions, right? And I think there's a bunch of copies of the report at the back if anyone wants to read it. So anyway, that was really fascinating to me and quite timely, right? And we did the research, and then now there's a lot of talk around this topic. You've had the new ETS review. I don't know which number we're on, but there's another ETS review, another permanent forest category consultation, and the market did not react positively to that either, right? So hopefully that advice from the report that we created has gotten to the Minister of Forestry, and hopefully he's taking that on as part of all the other things, bits of information he's getting. But for me, that was a really enjoyable way to do research that's important in New Zealand, that will get on the table of policymakers, right, is timely, and of course we're going to try and publish off it as well. And maybe before I move on to the other story, actually, I'll talk about the ETS a little bit. How are we going? Yeah, okay. So I talk about the ETS a lot lately, and it's just, to be honest, for me as an academic, this can be frustrating sometimes, right? Because I don't yet fully understand how government works, right? And I see a simple problem, a simple solution, a lot of evidence for those solutions. Why aren't we doing that, right? And then you get politics involved, right? So we have to understand also the context of our work, that we might be giving good advice, even get it on the right table, it's not necessarily going to be followed, right? And my supervisor always said, part of being an academic is you get rejected by journals. I think part of being an academic that wants to do policy relevant work is you get ignored, but you've got to keep trying. So anyway, under ETS, it's meant to be our main tool, supposedly, for reducing emissions in New Zealand. And in the Emissions Reductions Plan, the Climate Change Commission, they all say that depends on the price increasing, right? Yet you have the government also wanting prices not to increase because cost of living might increase. But that is the whole point of the ETS, is to raise the relative costs of emitting activities. So why would we then try to not let that cost rise to avoid rising costs, right? It's a bit strange. And I think the better solution would be to support those households that are most affected by the rising costs. And I think households, not companies. Anyway, the current proposal, the 4 options, which are really 2 options that are quite similar, if you go and read that consultation, I think there's 4 really simple solutions to get our ETS working again. And I've been trying to share this everywhere, so I'm trying to share it here. And some of them are probably a bit drastic and simplistic. But I think you abolish the industrial allocation and the perverse incentives it creates. You limit the sequestration credits to native forests, maybe transition forests, once they've successfully transitioned, right? You don't pay them before they actually achieve that so that the government doesn't take on that risk. You align the auction volumes and the overall volumes with the NDCs, and you remove price ceilings such as the cost containment reserve. The government should manage the supply of NZUs in line with our NDCs and let the market decide the price. That is the whole point. If we want to manage the price, just have a carbon tax, be done with it, right? Now, I prefer the ETS, but only if it works, so conceptually. Okay, so that's around carbon pricing and some collaboration, and I do a lot of media reports, media engagement now. Through having done policy work, my name sometimes comes up to them now. So another story around collaborating with government agency is around the climate-related disclosure standards. And again, for me, this started with submitting on consultations. So I sit on the Institute for Financial Professionals New Zealand, INFIN's advocacy committee, right? And so I help them do submissions to consultations when it's around sustainability climate issues. And it's actually really great because I get to, if I'm proactive enough, I get to write the whole submissions and then they just kind of check it and go, yep, great. And then I've got the whole voice of the finance industry behind that. So that's where that started, and more consultations around it, meeting people from the XRB more and more, and MFE. And now there was a call for proposals around a policy effectiveness evaluation of the climate-related disclosure standards, right? What difference does that policy actually make in decision-making and capital allocation? And so because I'd done the submissions, I'd met with the XRB, we actually got invited to also prepare a proposal alongside all your usual consulting entities that were getting a chance to propose. And we were successful in securing that. So now I've got a 3-year research project that's pretty decent funding for our department that doesn't really get research funding. It's research that I think can be impactful and relevant to the world, as there's not many mandatory climate reporting standards out there yet, and not much research around the effect they have. So I get to publish, I get some research money, I might get to travel a little bit, which is harder these days, right? And hopefully my research will have some impact because I'm not just focused on the journals. But again, that came from interacting with policymakers. Otherwise, I would have never even got the expression of interest invitation, right? And then beating out the consultants, and was just cherry on the cake. Anyway, those are 2 stories, my thoughts around the ETS. I think that's enough for now. Hopefully we'll get some questions. Thank you.